Hello. Today we're going to talk about serialization. It's a big, fancy, scary word, but it's pretty simple. So first, before we get into any of the code in programming, let's just talk about what the word serialization means. Let's just chat about it. It begins with an S, serialization. Let me turn off that light. So serialization is the process of going from our object in memory to data. More specifically, we usually serialize to a string or a database, maybe JSON. But it's a process of going from like, hey, here are all these like bits in memory. Let's just like store that as a string in a file somewhere, which itself is just bits in a different form of memory. So it is the conversion process when it comes to saving our data. That's what we mean when we say serialization. We also have deserialization, which, goes the other way. You probably could have guessed on that one. So, going from our game's memory when we're running the game and we like hit play and things are happening, variables are changing, they're stored in memory somewhere. And then if we want to save it ever, we need to serialize that. We're not going to make saving though right now. The reason is because it's difficult and complicated and out of scope, but we do use serialization on a daily basis. Unity serializes our game objects. We're making C# classes that extend from monobehavior, and they're called components, and they're saved as being attached to game objects in the scene. Well, when you save your scene file, Unity is serializing all of your game object properties into a data file. Let's take a look at that. So if we have, here's my player object that has a sprite renderer and has a certain color attached to these scripts attached. If we actually try to open our scene, our Unity scene in a text editor, what we'll see is that it's just text. It's this thing called YAML. It's just text. So if we find the game object that has the name player, this game object has these properties. It has components with these IDs, and it has the name player. It's just getting saved here as a string in a file, in a text file. We could change the name of it. We could call it Angus McDonald. Angus McDonald, right there. That's a reference to this podcast called The Adventure Zone. Anyway, back to all of our settings. Whenever we change a color or something, we are just setting the X, Y, and Z values, and they're getting stored here as curly bracket X colon the value, comma, Y colon value, comma, Z colon value, comma. And the computer is figuring out how to say, I think that this is a vector 3 and that this is the X property, this is the Y property, this is the Z property. Yes, good job. So don't edit your scene files directly, but just know that Unity is serializing, it is saving your objects. When you hit play, it will then create all of these C# objects in memory with those settings, with those properties. Neat. So when we make a property public, let's say I want to make my velocity property for my movement code public. That way, so velocity is 10, I can move around. And if I make velocity 1, I go a lot slower. Unity is actually editing this object from this text. So it's deserializing. So here, when we're in the inspector, we're using Unity's ability to serialize data types. such as floats. Neat. Cool. We learned some vocab. What do we do with this? Well, for one, we don't need our data types to be public in order for Unity to be able to serialize it. In fact, we can keep them as private, and that way other C# objects can't edit that. I don't want anything else changing the velocity. I just want to be able to edit it myself in the inspector, but I don't want like my other code, my input code to override it and to change it without me knowing. If they want to change this, you got to go through me. So we can keep it private, and we can use an attribute called Serialize Fields. What are attributes? Just circle back on that. First, Serialize Field says, hey, this field, another word for variable inside of a class. The pedants out there just like all had a panic attack when I said that. Serialize Field allows this private variable. It says, hey, Unity, put that one in the inspector. And now I can still change my velocity in the inspector down here, but the code is private. And this I would consider, if you're just trying to have your proper editable properties in the inspector, you probably want to use it this way. You probably don't want these things that are public all the time where other code can access it. Other times, we're going to have the exact opposite problem. Let's say I have other scripts that are looking at my current movement direction, and maybe the enemy is using that to calculate my velocity, so it can like shoot a bullet ahead and try to intercept me, and do some math. But it would need to know what direction I'm moving and what direction I'm facing. And in Unity, now these public properties are in my inspector, but these are all going to get immediately overwritten the second I start moving. If I give you my script here and it has these public properties, you're like, oh, I should edit that. That should be 4. And then it does nothing because it just gets completely immediately overwritten by the code. These shouldn't be in the inspector, in the Unity inspector. So we're going to use a second attribute called hide in inspector. Okay, that's 2 attributes, and I haven't explained what attributes are yet. So let's talk about attributes. Attributes are a C# feature that allow us to add metadata to certain parts of our code. They are square brackets, and for the most part, they shouldn't affect the script as it is compiled. They can if you have code that does things. But in Unity, attributes don't affect the way the code is compiled. Instead, Unity uses attributes, which are again just square brackets before a property or before a function or a class, in order to have some more knowledge, some more data, metadata about what that thing is and how to treat it and how to behave. They're used by properties a lot. Now I can see hide in inspector has hidden them. There are other other attributes that are useful. One of them is range. So now I can add this range property to the velocity field. Basically, they can stack. You can add as many as you want before a field, and they will stack. And the order sometimes matters, sometimes doesn't. Oh my gosh, I am all over the place. The order doesn't always matter. For the most part, it doesn't. It depends on what you're doing. Now I've made it a range, and Unity turned it into a slider. Look at that. Look at that. It's a slider. That's not what I want. A really useful attribute is called header. And we can give a sort of like a function call. We can give an attribute some properties with the same syntax as a function with parentheses, but all of that inside of the square brackets. And header will add look at this. We'll add the word configuration right there. You can't just like have it on its own. It needs to be like on something that is publicly serialized, because it is technically a property of the one variable. So if I added a header up here that was like bananas, you know, it wouldn't do anything because it's not actually serializing. It's not showing this in the inspector, so it's not showing its header. What are the other nifty attributes? The two others that we will use very often. One is called require component. Require component has a nifty syntax where you can't just give it the type. You have to give it type of parentheses the type, and then that is inside of the parentheses of the require component attribute. Oh my gosh, just memorize it. Or even better, use writer. Require component type of agent movement. So now, if I were to remove, oh, I can't remove the agent movement because player input is here. If I were to move player input and remove agent and add player input, it would automatically also add agent movement because that is required. It won't let me get rid of agent movement because it is required by the player input. So that's Unity saying, hey, this component is dependent on that component, and I'm going to enforce that dependency. Nice. We can make agent movement require a rigid body 2D, because it in fact does need a rigid body 2D to work, and it will be completely broken if you don't have one. And now it's like impossible not to have one. Neat. So my code is more, my scripts here, I can just add them to a game object and they won't configure themselves, but they will be much more difficult to set up incorrectly. And that's very useful. The last one is, what's a good example? I don't have a good example here. Let's say, maybe public void reset to center. Transform dot position equals vector 3.0 rigid body dot velocity equals 0. I don't know. Reset to center, right? Some utility that would very conveniently like move an object, I guess. I don't know. Another very useful attribute is one we can add to functions. It is called context menu. We set this to center, and it takes the property, takes a name. And that one gives us a new drop-down list, a new item in our drop-down. Reset this to center. So now I can trigger code automatically. Not automatically, myself, the opposite of automatically, manually. And that's very useful. It's also useful because the code will happen even when the game isn't running. In this case, it has a null reference to the rigid body because the awake function hasn't happened because the game isn't running. I use context menu functions all the time to do things like generate a bunch of stuff for me, instantiate random objects. I have a playing card game that I've been working on. I have a context menu function that just shuffles a deck because often when I'm testing, I want to just reset or shuffle or whatever without having to actually implement that into the code. Super useful for making little debug features, little quality of life things. It's excellent. In this case, moving it to the center, whatever. So those are attributes. There are many attributes, but Unity doesn't have a very good place that stores them. You can't, there's no good list of attributes. In fact, Unity tells us its list is what's the word I'm looking for? Table of contents. There's a list of the table of contents. So it's if if you just search Unity attributes, you'll be brought to this page. For Unity Engine attributes, see Add Component menu and its siblings. So just everything under that attributes tag. And we can see there's the context menu. Help URL attribute is very cool. Help URL. So now my agent movement code, if I go to the player and I click on this question mark, it opened up that website. View. Oops, not that one. This one. It opened it up. So I can add, if you're making components for someone else to use and you have documentation, you can add links to your documentation right inside. Unity obviously uses that one. Hide and inspector we use pretty often. Minimum, right? A minimum allowed value. Well, I wouldn't want to use range for my velocity, but I could use minimum value. It shouldn't be negative. Now, if I try to make it negative, it doesn't work. Negative 50, 0. It won't let me. Require component, range, serialize fields. Oops, serialize fields. And tooltip. Tooltip is the other very useful one. Tooltip. Let's give this one a tooltip. Tooltip. The movement speed in units per second. Hover over velocity, the movement speed in units per second. Amazing. Very useful. So now we can write our code that is nice and editable, our Unity components that are nice and easily editable, organized, and they have tooltips that explain what they do. And it is great. Cool. That's all I got for this one. There's no good list of all the attributes, but like these are the main ones: min, max, range, tooltip, serialize field, hide and inspector, header, require component, space. Space just makes a gap in the inspector if things are feeling cluttered, I guess. And then I'll show you a link just real quick to one of my favorite components. If you just search Unity naughty attributes, somebody has created a bunch of custom attributes. You can add them in the asset store, but it's also just on GitHub. And you can install a package for the package manager. You can do different things. You can download the script file, throw it in. It has a bunch of really useful features. One of which is a button. You can add the button tag to a function, and then it'll, instead of having to click the context menu and then the drop down, you just press the button. It can give you animation curves that limit their ranges and give them colors. Drop down lists on things that aren't just enums, enum flags. We don't know what that means. Lines. Notice boxes. I don't know. You can figure this out. It's like this. All this stuff I feel like should just be built into Unity, and it's like not. It's not. But I used to put this naughty attributes in like every project I ever made. It was like one of my starting assets because I used it all the time. While teaching, I got in the habit of like not using more third-party tools because students look at it and they go, "Oh, let me try that," and it doesn't work for obvious reasons. It's the code isn't installed. So anyway, that's it. Have a good one. Enjoy making your Unity components just a little bit easier to work with.